Okay, chapter 25, Baroque in Northern Europe. So last we discussed Baroque in Italy and in Spain in particular, and now we're going to discuss what Baroque looks like in Northern Europe. Do know that a lot of these Northern European artists are going to learn from being in Italy in particular, and also in some regards Spain, like Caravaggio, how his influence moved over into Spain that we talked about, but originally started in Italy, but was very quickly deterred from having any respectable appreciation for the arts, and so his styles quickly expanded over into Spain through Ribera as well as Gauguin and so on and so forth. So we're going to see how those influences in both Italy and then derivatively in Spain through Caravaggio and his followers are going to make their way up into the Northern European area. Now, what's happening contextually in Northern Europe at this time is widespread unrest and warfare. One in particular is the 30-Year War, which encompassed so many different kingdoms. And remember, we're not talking about countries yet, we're talking about kingdoms. And we have Spain, Netherlands, France, Germany, even the Ottoman Empire to the far east, which is going to establish Hungary and all kinds of different places that are going to be part of this 30-Year War. And it originated with militant Protestants and Catholics. So again, this Reformation and Counter-Reformation is going to create this unrest, again, like I said, for 100 years. And now this is like the compounded time, this 30-Year War, where all of these different kingdoms are going to be part of this religious, the militant activities are going to be derived from religious Reformation and Counter-Reformation. And remember, the Reformation is the beginnings of the Protestant churches, and they're pulling away from the papacy or the Catholic Church. So that's going to happen, and we're going to see, in particular with Flanders, be divided between north and south. The southern section is going to still be under the rule of Spain, which means that it's going to still be heavily influenced by the Catholic Church, because the Spanish kingdom under the Philips is still very much following, or is completely following, the Catholic Church. But then the northern part of Flanders is going to become what's known as the Dutch Republic. And that's really not going to have any ruler at all. There's not going to be a king. There's not going to be anyone voted in. Essentially, there's not going to be a empowered leader, and it's all going to transition into the hands of the wealthy mercantile class in the Dutch Republic. And Amsterdam, Holland, and all these different provinces that we know today are derivative of this Dutch Republic being reformers or Protestants separating from the Catholic Church. So that's how that's going to happen. I'm going to discuss the difference between the artwork that we're going to see in the southern part of Flanders and then the northern part of Flanders, which is going to be known as the Dutch Republic. Because of this wealthy mercantile lifestyle and all these different countries really developing based off of their commerce and their banking and their trading abilities, there's going to suddenly become this worldwide marketplace. And within this worldwide marketplace, which is something that is still occurring today globally, it's all derivative of this time. And with that worldwide marketplace of consumer goods, the fine arts and the arts are going to be put into that category of trade. So now we're going to start to see art move around the world. We're going to see art move over to from Europe over to Japan, Japanese art moving its way back over into Europe, and not just art, but also like teas and coffees. So we're going to see coffees start to become included in Europe from trades to other islands, or to islands, and then tea is going to make its way in from its trade to the Far East in China and in Japan in particular. So a lot of coalescing of cultural and worldly specializations are going to start to really come together. And also during this time, because there's so much great mercantile trade, and mercantile is just a word of saying merchant. So a merchant, somebody who is trading goods, either in the region, national or not nationally yet, but within the region, within the location in which they live, as well as between other kingdoms or soon to be other countries. So there's more disposable income, and that essentially means that you have $1,000. At that time, 1,000 was like almost $50,000 now. And once you pay off all those expenditures, then you have, let's say you're making 2,000, right? Then you have another 1,000 that's disposable. And there weren't big screen TVs, there weren't smartphones, there weren't any of these electronical devices that we have a tendency to put our disposable money towards now. Some of us don't have the disposable money to pay for them, and we put them on credit, and we end up getting ourselves into a little bit of a debt crisis. But in that time, that disposable money would go into artwork. And there's going to be some prevalent artists during this time that are going to essentially turn the whole idea of the fine arts from the higher class commissioners of wanting them to the middle class. And so the middle class is going to essentially soar at this time, and the artwork is going to be made for them as well as the upper echelons of society. So we're going to begin with Flanders. And we're going to start with figure 25, or if you want to look at the map, look at map 25.1. You can see how present-day Europe is really quickly being developed through this map. You can see Portugal's developed, Spain's developed, France has developed, the Dutch Republic, which is going to become your Amsterdam area, and all of that is being developed. Where it says a Holy Roman Empire, that's going to be Germany, so that's still developing. Austria is being developed. Switzerland, Hungary, Kingdom of Poland, the Ottoman Empire, which is ultimately going to become Greece and Bulgaria and Romania and all these other countries that are going to develop over time. Once these empires and these kingdoms finally fall, and that's going to happen very soon during the Enlightenment, and they're going to become countries and nations through a democratic rule versus that of kingdoms. So that's what the map shows us. Figure 25.2 is Peter Paul Rubens and Elevation of the Cross. And we're looking at Flanders right now, but we're looking at the southern part of Flanders that's still influenced by the Catholic Church. And so the artwork is still going to be influential in a manner of trying to emphasize visual imagery for the Counter-Reformation, keeping people devout in the Catholic faith instead of breaking away and become reformers as part of the Protestant Church, which is what Northern Flanders is going to do. So Northern Flanders in the Dutch Republic is going to be Protestants or reformers, and then the southern part of Flanders is going to be Catholic and counter-reformers. So southern part of Flanders is still going to be under the rule of Spain, which again is the brawn wingman of the Catholic Church. And so that, again, like I said, is going to make for artistic differences than the rest of this Northern European Baroque time. France is still going to be interested in following the Catholic Church, so we're going to see some influences there. And then also a painter in particular in the Dutch Republic by the name of Vermeer is going to have a devout and converted element of Catholicism for himself, and he's going to subtly include that. Even though all of his counterparts in the Dutch Republic are reformers and are Protestants, he himself converts to Catholicism, and the painting is going to reflect a little bit of that, and we'll talk about that. So there are little pockets of counter-reformers and Catholicism throughout the area of Northern Europe that is predominantly Protestant at this time, during this Baroque time. So the paintings here are going to retain close connections to the Baroque of the Catholic European area. in Italy and Spain, like we just talked about in the last chapter. And Rubens here, the elevation of the cross, is going to be that example of the connection with the Catholic European areas in Italy and Spain in particular. What Rubens is doing here with elevation of the cross is he's combining Renaissance and Baroque techniques. And that's what's going to make him so powerful and so well recognized during this time, is he's taking the mannerisms of the tragic, kind of very dramatic, or not dramatic, but more tragic. The dramatic that we saw is going to be with Caravaggio, which he's going to pull from here as well. But to begin with the Renaissance, Michelangelo, he's looking at Michelangelo's sculptures, and he's pulling from those very large-scale bodies that we saw with Michelangelo's sculptures, and in the mannerisms, in the tragic elements of the tragic mannerisms of Michelangelo's sculptures are present here in the paintings of Rubens. He's combining that with the colorist techniques that we talked about with Titian, as well as the dramatic and theatrical elements of Caravaggio. And Caravaggio, if you recall, was very much about angles and creating a scene that is in a dingy, slight environment. But instead, so he's taking the tenebrism of Caravaggio and the drama and the angles and the diagonals that you see here with Jesus on the cross. But he's placing it in a naturalistic environment, which is Renaissance. So by placing the activity of the elevation of the cross in a wooded scene or a naturalistic scene of nature, that is more Renaissance, okay? But the angle and the use of the tenebrism, of the sharp shift of shadowy darkness to highlights, that is Caravaggio and that is Baroque, okay? So again, Rubens is combining Renaissance and Baroque techniques coming from the Catholic European areas of Italy and Spain. All right? One thing with Rubens, he was so popular and was so sought after, and his artwork was desired worldwide, that he actually is one of the first noted to have a whole bunch of assistants. So he was the main architect. He was the main individual behind the making of the art and the one who was finalizing all the brushstrokes, but he had assistants that were working to build up the paintings for him as well. So he's not just the only painter. He would have a production system. So that he's one of the very first to have a production studio of paintings, and the assistants would help. He would have, I think he had up to 25, 30 assistants helping him, which is a lot. I mean, Michelangelo had assistants as well, but he was always the one who would finally touch the artwork and do it. The rest of the assistants would like stir the paint or bring the marble in, but he would be the only one that would touch the artwork. But not Rubens. Rubens, on the other hand. His work is going to be for the Catholic Church. This is for a cathedral. It originally was made for a church, but then it moved into the Antwerp Cathedral, that just means it moved up the ladder of acclaim for the Catholic Church, for the papacy, so it made its way into the cathedral instead of one of the small churches for the Catholic Church. His paintings help reinforce Flemish allegiance to Catholicism. So you got to realize that the northern part of Flanders broke away. They were reformers, but Rubens was using his paintings to reinforce that allegiance to Catholicism. So the artwork has symbols of Catholicism within it, the ornamentation, the elaboration, and the emotions and the drama that's part of Rubens' work that you see here with all the shifting figures is an element of allegiance to the Catholic Church. And again, he takes from Michelangelo by showing heroic, twisting, tragic, sculpted bodies. So even the bodies of the ones that are elevating the cross have this very twisted and very true to the Roman artist Michelangelo. And so they're portraying again that connection to the papacy with Michelangelo by Rubens emphasizing the important tragic features in the bodies of these figures that Michelangelo would do in his sculptures. And so Michelangelo is one of the very first prominent artists for the papacy. And Rubens is taking those techniques that he did and applying them in the paintings that he's doing presently to again reinforce the allegiance to the Catholic Church. He's also, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the connection here with Michelangelo and Caravaggio. So I just talked about Michelangelo. With Caravaggio again, he's foreshortening the anatomy. So the angle and the diagonal that you see in Jesus being elevated is that foreshortening technique that Caravaggio used quite magnanimously. And then also the dramatic tenebrism within this violent scene. So this is the scene of the ransom of Jesus in which he's being elevated on this stake, and you have that violent activity of him being pulled and drawn up into the air. And so again, that's something that Caravaggio would use using the tenebrism, and here he's doing it as well in the central panel. Okay, and he's kind of creating a dark environment of the nature behind the elevation of Jesus. It creates a physical and emotional tension, right? You can see that there's the emotional tension in the figures there to the far left panel, the solemnness of the figures in the top of the left panel. So there's a lot of emotional psychology going on. So you can feel that emotion and that tension, but then also the physicality by making the figures so robust looking. Even Christ himself has a robust feel to his anatomy that it creates a physical tension as well. You can almost feel as if the gravity is pulling on his body one way while the bodies of the ones elevating the stake are pushing in the opposite direction. So a lot of emotions, which is what the Catholic Church wanted. So these are techniques that are very important to the needs of the counter-reformers in the Catholic Church at the time. Human body in action will be Rubens' main subject matter. So we're not going to look at a whole bunch of his paintings, but do know that Rubens, when we know that it is his, we often will first look at the subject matter. Like for example, figure 25.3, Consequences of War. The human in action is the subject matter. Either the human in action is draped or undraped. Okay, either it's clothed or unclothed, but it's often, like you see in figure 25.3, Consequences of War, it's the movement of the human body that is the main activity and motion in the narrative of the painting. Okay, and through that, because of his interest in the human body in action, that couples him with, again, that Renaissance desire of referring to ancient classical sculptures. So that was very big with Greco-Roman time, where there was the human body, and in Greece in particular, is the main emphasis of activity. It was either the gods or it was an athlete that they were focused on, and the body itself was the landscape and the composition. And Rubens is now taking that, which is what Michelangelo did as well, and Caravaggio, and he's making the body itself the important factor to focus on. All right. So now let's talk about a little bit of still life. We discussed still life in the last chapter, and we talked about Cotan, right? And we also talked about Velasquez in the genre of still life painting and how it became a new form of painting, a new genre. And we didn't really see, I didn't mention this last time, we really didn't see still life paintings until all the way back in the Roman period, the middle to high Roman period of art. And they were attempting still life, and we didn't really see it come back around until Cotan there in the last chapter with the Baroque in Spain in particular. And then Velasquez in his water barrier painting, we saw him really focus on the ceramics and how that associated with the figures that were also in that scene. But those painters, Cotin in particular, and here with Clara Peters, 25.6, is really going to influence a lot of these future still life painters that we're going to see in the Dutch Republic. So we'll look at that a little bit too. But I want to focus more on this. And this is still life with flowers, goblet, dried fruit, and pretzels. And what she would do, and it's really important to know that there were a lot of really famous women artists at this time, but unfortunately many of them have not been recognized. So whenever I go through this, I'm going to make sure that whatever woman artist is present in this book is going to be emphasized. So we talked about Gentileschi, now we're going to talk about Clara, and then here in the Dutch Republic we're going to talk about Leicester. So all three of them are very prominent and very much respected in their field with their counterparts during their times. But here what Clara Peters would do is she paved the way for Dutch still life painters like Cotin did in Spain, like I just mentioned. And what both of them, if you recall from last chapter, Cotin, what he would do is he would put the inanimate, and remember what still life is, it's the artful arrangement of inanimate objects. The artful arrangement of inanimate objects. And often it's a desire in contrast between a reflective surface and a soft surface. A textured surface, a soft surface. A reflective surface, and an opaque surface. So showing the contrast between something that absorbs light, something that reflects light, something that is high in contrast with texture, and something that is soft and smooth. And what Cotin did is he put it all in a shadow box or in a niche, and then the environment became indeterminate and faded away. And Clara is doing the same thing in figure 25.6. And it's not about the environment behind the objects, it's about the objects themselves. So let me break it down here for you. She often created what were called breakfast pieces, and they are often a combination of food and flowers incorporated together, which was very much a Flemish Flanders desire, and also a Spanish desire. So by having these elaborate breakfasts, it reflected the interests of the Spanish kingdom, which ruled southern Flanders, and the Flemish folks of Flanders as well. So it was a combination of the two. So when we look at her still lives, we're looking into the edible life of the southern Flemish as well as the Spanish at the time. So that's why we call them breakfast pieces, because that was a very prominent thing, is to have flowers and food arranged and incorporated together for breakfast. So she's just showing us that through these objects. She wanted to, again, have smooth and reflective surfaces, and also soft petals, so showing that softness but with a slight amount of contrast in the texture of the goblet, as well as some of the pretzels that you see here, some of the definition in the flower petals, as well as the other edibles that are present there in the ceramic dish in the middle. She often would paint with dark backgrounds, negating any depth of deep space. So she doesn't want you to focus on the environment or the nature around the objects. She wants you to know that they're placed in an overall greater environment, but she doesn't want you to get lost in foreground, middle ground, and background. She wants you to focus on the one ground in which they are all resting upon. But she does want to show, and that's what Cotin did as well. So be able to kind of compare Clara with Cotin from last chapter and then this chapter. But she would give depth for the viewer, but it's in the foreground, which is something that's a little different. Instead of focusing on depth in the background, she's focusing on depth in the foreground, which makes the viewer feel as if he or she is present in front of these inanimate objects. And how she does that is she has the petals invade the viewer's space in the foreground. So if you look at the bottom left, you see the petals from the flowers and the leaves from the flowers overlapping the wood table in which the inanimate objects are playing on. So instead of showing the movement of placement of objects going into the background, it's more about an emphasis on the foreground, which is another way of saying the viewer that's viewing this is equally important by bringing the outside world into the inside of the painting. Which, if you recall with Velasquez, what he did with Las Meninas is he incorporated the king and the queen into the painting, which brought the outside viewer into the painting. And she's doing it here with this still life by having the leaves in the petals overlapping the edge of the table in the front, in the foreground, incorporating you as the viewer into the still life painting, which is a Baroque technique, all right, to bring all this expansive outside world into the inside or the interior narrative and activities of the painting. All right, I'll leave you at that, and we'll get into the Dutch Republic in the next video.